I feel reasonably confident in assuming that this is a Stegosaurus, or at least is supposed to be a Stegosaurus. There's a lot wrong with it, so let's get right into it. Head's way too big. Stegosaurus had a really small head, even for a Stegosaurian. Head should be about a 1/12 the length of its overall body, and really narrow. It's sort of a wedge in this case. It would be more fluted on the sides, and it's definitely got a sort of a convex top on it, and you need it to be flat on top. Let's see. Eyebrow ridges are clearly raised above the level of the head. It did have eyebrow ridges, but they were straight out. They weren't raised above the cranium. I don't know if you can tell, but the nostrils are sort of facing forward, and they really should be facing outward to accommodate the beak, which is another thing. It had a beak. Let's talk about dentition. They turned it into a carnivore, which you see a lot in this kind of dinosaur toy. Really inaccurate in this case, because for starters, it means that they took away its cheeks, and it needs cheeks. To accommodate those cheeks, the teeth were inset from the edge of the head, so they weren't around the outer rim like they are on this toy. It's damaged, but you can see that the teeth are supposed to go all the way to the front of the mouth, which is also inaccurate. All Stegosaurians had the premaxillary and the predenta teeth gone and replaced by a beak. Except Huayangosaurus, but this is clearly not a Huayangosaurus, so shut up. I mentioned it had cheeks, but the arrangement of its jaw was such that we don't think it was able to actually chew so much as sort of chop. So the previous owner, who I think was named Tony, has filled it with rocks, which is a valiant effort, Tony, but I don't think this particular dinosaur, I don't think we've ever found gastroliths associated with an individual of the genus Stegosaurus. Would have helped, though. Moving on to the neck. Not terribly inaccurate, actually. They have it, it's kind of hard to tell because it's so short, which is also rather accurate. Stegosaurus had a very short neck, even for a Stegosaurian. But it's held off the ground, clearly, which is accurate. It would have held its head about 3 or 4 feet off the ground. It didn't really have the S curve like an Archosaur, but it at least had its head held up. It wasn't a lizard, despite the name. You can tell it clearly lacks throat armor, however. It's just sort of smooth skin. And I realize not every Stegosaurus was found with neck armor in the associated detritus, but some of them had it, so it would be a nice detail to put on the toy. They've done the classic sort of crocodile front leg posture that you see on the quadrupedal toys, which I'm pretty sure is just so that they'll be more stable as toys, or maybe it's supposed to look fierce. You could argue, they keep doing this to Kentrosaurus too, where they put the legs out like this for some reason. I think it's supposed to be an action pose, but if it's supposed to be an action pose, why is its head facing straight forward? Its head should be facing backward, or at a 90-degree angle, so its eye is facing backward, so it's looking at the thing that it's hitting with its tail. So there, I blew a huge hole in your fake argument. That said, the front legs are probably a little too long. Stegosaurus, you'll keep hearing me say this, it was actually not that representative of its family. Like, it had the most extreme pronounced ratios of the Stegosaurians. So really short front legs in comparison to its hind limbs. Speaking of the hind limbs, having the femur be that long compared to the lower leg is actually not bad. It had about that ratio. That said, they have it set really high on the animal. Like, they don't seem to have left any room for the hip or the spine. It just sort of goes into the top of the back there. Also, the thigh is not very muscular, especially on the other side. Like, it's got pretty scrawny legs for a Stegosaurus. But the ilium has a low profile, which I guess is accurate, but the what's it called? The sacrum. The ilium has a low profile, which is accurate, but the sacrum should be much taller because they had the spinal processes that were really high. While we're talking about the legs, let's talk about the feet, which are terrible. These are really primitive feet to put on a late Jurassic dinosaur. It sort of has lizard feet when it really should have more like an elephant foot, but with 3 toes in the back and 5 toes actually in the front, but only the innermost 2 had claws or hooves. I should say hooves, because they had pads under the feet, just like an elephant, but the toes projected out a little more, so they're sort of halfway between a claw and a hoof. In fact, when Marsh found these, I suppose he didn't find them himself, but when Marsh described these, the second species he named, which we're not sure is actually a species despite what we just found in Portugal, he called it ungulatus. The species was ungulatus, which means hoofed. So, and he thought it was like a big lizard pangolin. So, I mean, that's all he knew about it was that, hey, this definitely has hooves. So the feet are important. It's the size of an elephant. It can't walk on its ankles. It has to walk on its toes. As far as posture goes, we're actually not bad either, at least in front of the back legs. The Stegosaurus' posture is actually pretty famous because it's very dramatic with the rounded back going into the hip. It's dragging its tail, though, and that's just shameful. Its tail is really skinny, too. Like, Stegosaurus' tail was its primary weapon, so it was very muscular. It was flexible. It actually lacked osteoderm, so it was flexible, but it was flexible horizontally. So it wouldn't have had the, straight out like maybe a hadrosaur or really any ornithopod, but it would have been off the ground at least. Let's talk about the plates. They're not bad. They're at least kite-shaped, which is more than you see in a lot of Stegosaurus toys. But really, for starters, there should be more variation in the size. Like, it's cool that they have it go sort of real small to real big to real small again in a smooth curve, because that's what Stegosaurus had, which again is really unique for a Stegosaurian. Like, mostly they sort of have abrupt changes once you get to the hip. But the ones over the hip should be very large, and the ones on the neck and the end of the tail should be very small, especially the neck. The largest plates would be like 1/10 of the length of the entire creature. So if it's like a 20-foot creature, a 2-foot plate, and that's 2 feet wide and 2 feet tall. The ones over the neck aren't bad, but as you go farther back, they should be raked backwards more and more. Especially, this is probably a stenops, so they can probably get away with this, but if it were bigger, like Armatus, then definitely rake them back. They have the plates arranged in a staggered where they're not right across from each other. We have no idea if that's accurate, but that's what you see a lot in the reconstructions, and I'm prepared to say, yeah, go for it. That makes sense. Makes a lot more sense than having one row, because then they don't all fit. Incidentally, as far as numbers go, it's probably got the right number of plates. It varied, obviously. Now let's talk about the Thagomizer, because that is terrible. It's tiny, and this animal would have been eaten by allosaurs almost immediately. They need to be bigger. Like the length of the spikes on the Thagomizer would have been about as long, if not longer, than the tallest plates on its back. They need to be closer to the tip of the tail, and they need to be horizontal. You tend to see on toys, they'll always put the Thagomizer arranged sort of vertically, or at least in a V. They were more horizontal than V-shaped because the way it used it was to swing it horizontally. On the subject of Stegosaurus' tail, when Marsh first found it, it wasn't the first one, it was one of the specimens he described. He noticed a space in the pelvis area, It actually exists in sauropods too, but he saw it in Stegosaurus first. And he theorized that since its brain is so exceptionally small, its brain is like the size of a dog's brain, but it's an animal the size of an elephant, so it couldn't have been very smart. Admittedly, you don't have to be very smart when all you're doing is eating the food that's in front of your face and swinging your tail at anything that looks at you funny, but still, tiny brain. He figured it needed help, and he figured it must have had a second brain in its tail to control the reflexes in its tail. The only reason I mention this is because Pacific Rim, a 2013 major motion picture, perpetuated the myth that dinosaurs could have second brains. And especially considering that it was a scientist character that said it. I mean, I love Charlie Day, but guys, no second brain. It was probably just the gland that provides the fluid for the neurological system. But not a second brain. Stop making dinosaurs seem dumb. And that's really all I need to cover on the Stegosaurus. This has been Your Dinosaurs Are Wrong. Please like, comment, and subscribe, or even go to thegeekgroup.org where you can find out how to become a member and donate, and we'll see you next time. Well, that was episode 2. I don't know whether I actually did more research for that one, or if I just happened to know more about Stegosaurus off the top of my head. If I took notes during the pre-production of that, they have not come down to me. I wish they had, because at one point I said that Stegosaurus only had 2 nails on its hand. That is not the case. They had 3, like most dinosaurs would have. I really should have mentioned that in 2010, Center put out a paper looking at the manus, the hand of Stegosaurus, of Stegosaurs, and found that like sauropods, or somewhat like sauropods, they had a tubular structure to their hand for bearing weight. This is different from their hind feet, where it's sort of quasi-plantigrade, where it's got a fleshy pad supporting the weight of the animal. The hand, it's standing on the hand bones. It bears repeating that Stegosaurus has a convoluted taxonomic history. We would expect as much with an animal that's been around so long. As far as I know, Ungulatus is still a valid species, but Armatus is not, and I should not have implied that it was, because Armatus not being valid is the reason that stenops is now the type. Relatively minor note, but the largest plate is not, as I said in the video, over the hip. It's actually over the base of the tail, so it's a little further back. In sum, the entire animal that we showed at the end of the video received a radical overhaul a few years later because a complete specimen called Sophie was discovered and described. We actually did a follow-up on that in 2018, so we'll just show you all that. There was a study in late 2015 which revised a lot of what we thought we knew about Stegosaurus, and the authors published it open access, so you should go check it out. There's even a 3D PDF of the skeleton, which I didn't know PDFs could do, but sure, why not? Stegosaurus has always been kind of a weird outlier among the stegosaurs, not just because it has giant plates all the way down its back rather than spikes or smaller plates, but they have that high arched back, that short little neck, and a really large difference in length between their forelimbs and their hind limbs. So when this new specimen gets described and upends a lot of this weirdness, my reaction was less, whoa, no way, and more, oh, yeah, that makes sense. But that's what good science feels like most of the time, so let's dig into this. Most specimens of Stegosaurus that aren't isolated elements are less than half complete. The few more complete specimens we do have either preservation or preparation issues that prevent us from getting good 3D reconstructions of them, which is a problem in this, the age of the 3D biomechanical analysis. The authors note that the last full description of the animal was by Gilmore in 1914, which you can also read. So anytime you've seen a full Stegosaurus skeleton mounted or as a diagram, that's a composite, meaning there are parts from different specimens adjusted to fit together to approximate a complete skeleton. Doing this comes with some baggage, because even if two sets of bones are from the same species, they've spent millions upon millions of years in the Earth, which transforms fossils. There might have been individual or sexual variation between those individuals before they died. Even if there's a difference in age between them, their proportions are going to be different because animals grow allometrically. So if you don't correct for these issues, you're going to wind up with a very inaccurate reconstruction. Fortunately, paleo workers have knowledge and tools and do correct for these and other issues, and they can check their work against related animals. But in the late 19th century, we only had very fragmentary remains of what we now know are other stegosaurids, so workers really had no guidelines for what this crazy new dinosaur looked like. Which is how we got the single row of plates, or Marsh's early ideas where it looked basically like a pangolin. In the early 20th century, we began finding more complete stegosaurs, but a certain view was becoming fashionable in the paleontological community that dinosaurs were an evolutionary dead end, that they had once been well adapted to their environment, but ultimately they ran out of steam, and instead of changing with the times, they started wasting their energy, growing horns and frills and spikes for display. And because Stegosaurus, restored as this stupid, lethargic creature waiting around for the mammals to supersede it, really just fit with the thinking of the time, there wasn't much impetus to examine Stegosaurus critically. Until the later part of the 20th century and the dinosaur renaissance, when we did start seeing workers reconsider how Stegosaurus carried themselves, how they participated in their ecosystem, but even then, the basic proportions of the animal at the skeletal level were still basically where they had been with Gilmore. Until Sophie, which was found in 2003 at Red Canyon Ranch, private dig site in Wyoming, and is now at the Natural History Museum in London. It is a relatively complete specimen of Stegosaurus, finally. It's missing only the hand, parts of many vertebrae, and the base of the tail. It is an immature specimen. It's no longer a stegling, but based on the mixture of fused, partially fused, and unfused sutures between bones, the researchers think that it is a subadult or young adult. It is a Stegosaurus stenops, which incidentally replaced Armatus as the type species in 2013. Which is relevant to us because that's the same species we did an episode on. It turns out, Stegosaurus have shorter torsos and longer necks than we thought. That is, there are more cervical vertebrae and fewer dorsal vertebrae. Their rear legs aren't so much monstrously longer than their forelegs. Their tails are a tad longer, with the plates more spaced out along their spines, and their thagomizers are turned downwards, all of which makes it hard to see thagomizers as just being display structures. They would clearly be effective weapons. The most important takeaway from this study going forward is that having a detailed, accurate description of the animal allows researchers to model it for analysis of its biology, like this one by the same authors, where they compare a volumetric method of estimating the animal's mass with the more algorithmic method derived from limb bone measurements. The researchers arrive at 1.5 tons for Sophie, whereas the bivariate equations are like 1.8 to 2 tons. So maybe Stegosaurus aren't as heavy as we thought, but the main takeaway is that ontogeny of a specimen can wildly change mass estimates if we're relying on limb bone equations, which goes right back to our starting problem that fragmentary remains are sometimes misleading. Overall, like I said, this study brings Stegosaurus in line with our current understanding of stegosaurs and even dinosaurs as a whole. It's still the Stegosaurus we know and love, it's just, a real animal. There's a reason we don't do Synapisodes entirely with animation anymore. It turns out that my reconstruction of a theoretical adult Stegosaurus might be wrong in some of the particulars, because as Stegosaurus ages, the vertebrae towards the sacrum get quite tall, whereas the forelimbs don't stay proportional to the hind limbs. The hind limbs are somewhat longer in older specimens of Stegosaurus than they are in younger specimens, so a fully ontogenetically mature Stegosaurus
would be a little bit closer to the classic restoration of Stegosaurus than Sophie is. Still not the extreme, like, Greg Paul Stegosaurus that we had before, though. As an herbivorous ornithischian, I am obligated to mention whether it had cheeks, and the evidence for Stegosaurus specifically is pretty ambiguous. It's just the shape of the skull leaves a shelf where you might expect there to be cheeks, but relatives of this animal tell us that probably we would not see cheeks, at least not the way that mammals have cheeks. We talked about this extensively in Iguanodon. It's not clearly known how much Stegosaurus would have even needed to keep food in its mouth, which is the function of cheeks. The beak at the front of the mouth might have just extended further back with maybe a softer, less keratinized portion, or less mineralized rather. It could have just had lizard-like lips behind the beak. Those would hold in food just fine for the amount of processing that Stegosaurus was doing. There was actually 2016 research on the bite mechanics of a few dinosaur herbivores, and Stegosaurus was one of them. It found that Stegosaurus could produce high bite forces and endure moderate stress to the jaws, which implies that they could feed on a variety of plant sources. I really should have talked more in the original video about different hypotheses about how the plates should be arranged. We mentioned the very early turtle or pangolin-like restoration, but after that it was restored with a single row of plates, then a paired double row. But to do that, the worker named Lowell had to actually sculpt mates for most of the plates out of plaster because Stegosaurus's plates don't have symmetry, which is the main reason that most workers restore them alternating, because when an animal has an element on one side and an element on the other side, they're almost always going to be pretty closely paired. Not always, as we saw with Styracosaurus, but usually. But in the video I said that the plates wouldn't all fit in one row, which is kind of true if you look at the early restorations, but in 1987 a worker named Jurassic found a solution to this, which is to arrange them in one row, but have them alternating in how they lean. Because the bases of the plates, as you can see on this toy, the base of each plate is pretty narrow, so you can kind of fit them all together if you have them leaning apart from each other. The exception is right over the hip in Stegosaurus ungulatus. The plates actually do appear to be paired. Now there is one specimen which is preserved somewhat articulated and laying on its side, and it preserves matrix. There's rock in between the plates of the left side and the plates of the right, which for that rock to be there, that would mean that there was space there in life. There was some distance between the left and the right-hand side plates, which would seem to go against Jurassic's proposal. I noticed that the mount of Sophie seems to arrange them the way Jurassic would have, but overall, as we saw with how Ungulatus has some of its plates paired, and as we see how the little plates at the front of the neck could credibly be in one row, there seems to have been either individual or species level or even sexual variation in plate morphology and how the plates were arranged on the animal's back. In support of that last one, there was a 2015 paper on Hesperosaurus, which has occasionally been recovered as a species of Stegosaurus, but I think currently it is not, where they found that there are two distinct morphs of plates. There's one morph that has large, wide, oval-shaped plates, and the other that has tall, narrow, diamond-shaped plates. And when you have two morphs like that, workers tend to think, oh, we've got sexual dimorphism here. So if that's true for Hesperosaurus, it could be something that was going on with Stegosaurus. I talked about this a bit in Velociraptor, but trying to infer dinosaurs' intelligence is quite fraught. There was a paper this year trying to estimate neuron counts in dinosaurs, and we might talk about that at some point, but just saying this animal had a body the size of an elephant but a brain the size of a dog means it was stupid, that's not something we should use to determine intelligence or try to infer behavior. On that note, it was in 1880 that Marsh had originally described the hindbrain of Stegosaurus, the sacral chamber. Now, that chamber actually shows up in a bunch of dinosaurs. It's just that it is unusually large in Stegosaurus, is what caused him to think, oh, we've got a second brain here, and I think this myth is actually still with us. But there are some quirks to this, because Marsh noticed that the so-called hindbrain was proportionally larger in younger animals, which is something that brains do. So he wasn't making this up out of thin air, which I feel like I might have been implying in the video. Another weird idea Marsh had in 1880 was that the large difference in length between the forelimbs and the hind limbs of Stegosaurus implied to him that this animal might have been bipedal when it was out of the water, because of course he was imagining this animal being semi-aquatic. It was the 1880s. Bipedalism in Stegosaurus has pretty much only ever come up as a joke. There is a trackway from the smaller animal Kentrosaurus, from what is today Tanzania, I believe, that seems to show that animal walking bipedally. But like I said, that's a smaller animal, proportionally longer tail than Stegosaurus. I don't think anybody would suggest Stegosaurus as anything other than quadrupedal and maybe able to rear and sit on its tail, but even that might be pushing it. But there's one locomotory hypothesis that I haven't mentioned yet, and it involves the plates. That's right. This hypothesis suggests that the plates were not for display, or for thermoregulation, or for species identification, but acted as airfoils. This is the work of one Dr. Balau from Ogden, Utah, and then the author Edgar Rice Burroughs, like 10 years later, suggested that the plates of Stegosaurus were used for gliding off of cliffs, because these were obviously ornithischian animals, and therefore they're the ancestors of birds. And to my knowledge, no toy company has had the courage, has had the audacity to portray this in a product for market. Until now. I saw this kite and I had to share it with you guys, because it's like a series of decisions had to be made to make this product, and all of them are baffling. Like, if they were starting from, we need to make dinosaur kites, I can't imagine why they would pick Stegosaurus, unless they already had this artwork. But like, it's a custom kite. They had to specifically design pieces that would support exactly this artwork to make a flying Stegosaurus. Unless they were in on the joke and they too are familiar with that old newspaper clipping, but I can't imagine that's the case. Maybe it's just a funny coincidence. But we have actually been sent a number of other Stegosaurids, so I presume we'll be coming back to Stegosaurus in the context of trying to understand its relatives. But for now, I hope you enjoyed this re-upload of our second ever episode, and I want you all to remember to like, comment, and subscribe, and we'll see you next time. We would like to extend a special thank you to these individuals who have gone above and beyond to support this show. We could not have done it without you. Thank you.